That bell has not rung in 20 years. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed said the words quietly, but the old firehouse answered before anyone else could. The bronze bell above the front entrance moved again. One deep note rolled through Station 7, shaking dust from the rafters and cutting across the midnight rain. Mason looked at the clock above the radio desk. 12:07 in the morning. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the windows while wind pushed through the dark streets of Pine Hollow, Oregon. The station smelled of wet canvas, engine oil, and coffee that had been left warming too long. Mason stepped away from the equipment table and reached for his yellow rescue jacket. He expected to find a broken rope or a tree branch striking the bell. Instead, beneath the hanging cord stood a German shepherd. The dog was soaked from nose to tail. His sable coat clung to a powerful frame, and a faded red rescue collar circled his neck. He held the bell rope between his teeth. When Mason opened the door, the shepherd released it. The bell sounded once more, softer this time. Then the dog looked directly at him. His amber eyes were alert, exhausted, and filled with an urgency Mason recognized before he understood it. "Easy boy," Mason said. "Come inside." The German shepherd did not move. Rainwater streamed from his ears and gathered beneath his paws. Mason crouched slowly. That was when he saw the marks on the concrete. Small red prints crossed the entrance in an uneven line. The dog's paw pads were scraped and tender, likely from gravel, broken brush, or a long run over rough ground. Mason reached toward one front paw, but the shepherd stepped back. Not afraid. Refusing delay. "You did not come here for yourself." The dog lowered his head and placed something on the floor between them. It was a blue rescue inhaler, wet from the storm and marked with mud. Mason picked it up and wiped the label with his thumb. The name beneath the water came into focus. Eli Whitmore. Mason stopped breathing. Eli was 9 years old. He was the son of Gunnery Sergeant Caleb Whitmore, the Marine who had once been Mason's closest friend. The man whose family Mason had avoided since the funeral 4 years earlier. The radio behind him remained silent. No accident had been reported. No emergency call waited in the county system. Yet Caleb's former K-9 stood at the station door with wounded paws and the boy's inhaler. "Atlas," Mason whispered. The German shepherd's ears lifted at his name. Mason touched the faded red collar and found a torn strip of seat belt material caught beneath the buckle, along with a small piece of gray fabric from a child's jacket. A vehicle. A child. No call for help. Atlas turned toward the road and gave one sharp bark. Then he pushed the station door with his paw. Mason rose, grabbed the radio, and keyed the emergency channel. Station 7 responding to a possible unreported vehicle accident. Prepare the rescue truck. Atlas looked back once, making certain Mason understood. Then the German shepherd stepped into the midnight rain, leaving another faint red print beneath the silent bell. 3 hours earlier, Station 7 had felt less like a firehouse than an empty ship anchored in the rain. Mason Reed stood alone beneath the fluorescent lights, checking rescue harnesses while freezing water traced crooked paths down the windows. The storm had reached Pine Hollow before sunset, coating the mountain roads with slick mud and filling the roadside ditches faster than county crews could clear them. Wind moved through the old brick building with a low whistle. Somewhere in the apparatus bay, a loose chain tapped against the side of the rescue truck. Mason worked methodically. He tested the portable radios, counted medical bags, inspected the winch cable, and replaced 2 weak batteries in the thermal camera. Routine gave his hands something useful to do. Captain Ruth Delgado had gone home briefly to check on her elderly mother, and the remaining volunteers were scattered across town, dealing with fallen branches and damaged power lines. Mason had offered to cover the station alone. He told everyone he preferred the quiet. The truth was less simple. On the wall above the equipment desk hung a photograph from a community safety day 5 years earlier. Gunnery Sergeant Caleb Whitmore stood in the center wearing a Firehouse t-shirt beneath his Marine jacket, one hand resting on the shoulders of a younger Atlas. The German shepherd looked straight at the camera, ears high, faded red collar still new. Mason stood beside them in the photograph, smiling in a way he no longer recognized. Caleb had grown up in Pine Hollow and volunteered at Station 7 before joining the Marine Corps. Whenever he came home on leave, he returned to the station, repaired old equipment, and taught children how to call for help. He had also taught Atlas to pull the bronze bell rope on command. Back then, Everyone treated it like a harmless trick. Mason reached up and turned the photograph face down against the wall. For years had passed since Caleb's funeral. For years since Mason had stood near the back of the chapel, unable to meet Sarah Whitmore's eyes or speak to the 9-year-old boy holding her hand. He had promised himself he would visit after the first week, then after the first month. Each delay made the next attempt feel heavier. Eventually, silence became a habit. The coffee maker clicked off behind him. Mason poured the last cup and carried it toward the radio desk. County Dispatch reported minor flooding near Mill Creek, a disabled pickup on Route 8, and one power line down near the elementary school. Nothing from Old Mill Road. Nothing connected to Sarah or Eli. Mason checked the storm map. The northern road remained open but poorly covered by radio towers once it entered the forest. A vehicle could leave the pavement there without anyone seeing from the highway. He stared at the map longer than necessary, then looked toward the darkened photograph. "You would tell me I am overthinking it," he said quietly. The station gave no answer. Rain struck the roof harder. Mason returned to the rescue truck and placed an extra child-sized oxygen mask inside the medical compartment. He did not know why. Perhaps experience. Perhaps instinct. Perhaps some part of him had never stopped listening for the family he had failed to face. At 12:07, the old bronze bell moved above the entrance, and one deep note rolled through the empty station. The bell's final note faded into the rafters as Mason crossed the apparatus bay and opened the front door. Freezing rain swept beneath the awning, carrying the scent of wet pine and cold pavement. Atlas stood beneath the hanging rope, his chest rising quickly, his sable coat dark with water. The German shepherd looked thinner than Mason remembered, but the old discipline remained in his posture. Ears forward, eyes steady, waiting for the human to understand. "Atlas," Mason said. The dog released the rope and stepped toward him. His front paws left faint red marks across the concrete. Mason crouched and reached for the nearest paw, but Atlas pulled back before he could examine it. There was no fear in the movement, only impatience. "You ran a long way." Atlas looked toward the road. Mason tried to guide him inside, where the floor was warm and the medical kit waited beside the truck. The German shepherd refused to cross the doorway. He lowered his head, opened his mouth, and placed a blue inhaler at Mason's feet. Water ran from its plastic casing. Mud covered part of the label. Mason picked it up and wiped it clean against his sleeve. Eli Whitmore. The name seemed to empty the air from the station. Mason knew Eli had asthma. Caleb used to carry an extra inhaler during every family trip, even when the boy was still small enough to sleep through most of the drive. Mason looked at Atlas again. "Where is he?" The dog turned toward the darkness and barked once. Mason examined the faded red collar more carefully. A narrow strip of seat belt material had twisted beneath the buckle. A small piece of gray fabric clung beside it, matching the kind of insulated jacket children wore during Oregon winters. Tiny grains of safety glass sparkled in the wet fur near Atlas's shoulder. Mason's training assembled the clues before his heart was ready. A vehicle had left the road. Atlas had escaped through a damaged window. Eli had given him the inhaler or the dog had carried it from the vehicle. Either way, the boy needed help. Mason keyed his radio. "Captain Delgado, respond to Station 7. Possible unreported vehicle accident involving Sarah and Eli Whitmore." Atlas arrived on foot with Eli's inhaler. Static filled the speaker before Ruth's voice came through. "Copy. I am 6 minutes out. Do you have a location?" Mason looked toward the county map. "Not yet." He named several roads near the Whitmore home. Atlas remained still until Mason said, "Old Mill Road." The German shepherd's ears rose. He pushed the station door with one paw and gave another sharp bark. Mason marked the reaction. Probable Old Mill Road corridor. Northbound. He opened the rescue truck, lowered the rear step, and called Atlas aboard. The dog would not move. Mason lifted the medical bag and approached slowly. "Let me wrap your paws." Atlas backed into the rain, keeping his gaze fixed on the road. He would accept no comfort while the family remained missing. Headlights turned into the station lot as Captain Delgado arrived with 2 volunteers. Mason held up the inhaler. Ruth read the name and understood immediately. Load the winch kit, stabilization struts, and pediatric oxygen. Atlas watched each piece enter the truck. Only when Mason pointed the vehicle north and opened the side door did the German shepherd climb inside. He stood behind the windshield, rainwater dripping from his coat, and stared toward the forest as if every second carried the weight of a child's breath. The rescue truck pulled away from Station 7 with its lights cutting red and white paths across the rain-dark pavement. Captain Ruth Delgado drove, while Mason sat beside her with the county map open across his knees. 2 volunteers secured equipment in the rear compartment, and Atlas stood between the front seats, balancing against each turn with his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Old Mill Road is nearly 8 miles long, Ruth said. We need more than a direction. Mason pointed toward the first fork beyond the town limits. Let him choose. Ruth slowed as they reached the intersection. The left route climbed toward a logging road. The right followed the river north. Atlas watched both through the windshield, then pressed his muzzle toward the right side of the glass and released a low bark. Ruth turned north. The German Shepherd settled again, but only for half a mile. When the truck passed a narrow service road, Atlas struck the door once with his paw. Stop, Mason said. Ruth braked carefully on the wet shoulder. Mason opened the side door, and Atlas stepped down into the freezing rain. His paws touched the gravel, leaving faint red marks that disappeared almost immediately beneath the water. He lowered his nose to the ground and moved toward the service road. Mason followed with a flashlight while Ruth guided the truck behind them. The beam revealed broken twigs, disturbed mud, and a line of paw prints leading from the forest. Atlas had traveled this way before reaching the station. He came nearly 3 miles through these woods, one volunteer said over the radio. Mason looked at the dog's tired stride. And he is taking us back the same way. After several hundred yards, the road divided again. The truck began toward the wider branch, but Atlas stopped. He stood in the rain and refused to move. Ruth reversed, turned toward the narrower lane, and waited. Only then did Atlas continue. His message was precise. Follow me. Do not guess. The lane climbed through dense pine before joining Old Mill Road near the river. Wind pushed fallen needles across the pavement. Visibility dropped below 50 yards. Mason persuaded Atlas into the truck long enough to wrap his front paws with clean gauze and protective boot covers. The dog allowed the treatment only while the vehicle kept moving. Each time Ruth slowed, Atlas stood again. Mason held the blue inhaler in one hand and watched the forest through the windshield. He remembered Eli at 5 years old, sitting on Caleb's shoulders during the community safety fair. The boy had laughed every time Atlas rang the bell. Mason had been there. He had known this family before grief turned every visit into something he postponed. No signal from Sarah's phone, Ruth said. County Dispatch shows no emergency beacon from her vehicle. The ravine blocks cell service, Mason replied. If they left the road, no one would see them from above. Atlas suddenly moved forward, ears rigid. Ruth reduced speed. Ahead, the guardrail disappeared behind a fallen cedar. At first, it looked intact. Then the headlights shifted, revealing a section bent outward toward the ravine. Mason stepped from the truck and found fresh tire marks crossing the muddy shoulder. A child's black glove hung from a thorn bush below the road. Atlas jumped down, sniffed it once, then hurried toward the slope. Mason raised his hand. Harness first. He clipped a safety line to the dog's rescue collar and secured another around his own waist. From somewhere beneath the rain and rushing water came a faint mechanical sound. A horn. Weak. Continuous. Trapped in the darkness below. Atlas pulled toward it, and Mason followed him over the broken edge. Mason descended the slope one careful step at a time, keeping the safety line taut while Atlas moved ahead through wet brush. The ground dropped sharply beneath the broken guardrail, and rainwater ran in narrow streams over loose soil. Captain Delgado remained above, securing the main rope to the rescue truck and directing the volunteers as they prepared stabilization equipment. Mason's flashlight swept across pine trunks, exposed roots, and finally the pale reflection of metal below. The sport utility vehicle rested on its passenger side between 2 large trees, its front end angled toward Mill Creek. 10 feet beyond it, dark water moved fast around rocks and fallen branches. The vehicle had not reached the creek, but the mud beneath it was slowly giving way. Atlas pulled harder. Easy, Mason said. We found them. A weak horn sounded again from inside the vehicle. Mason approached from the uphill side and called through the broken rear window. Sarah, this is Staff Sergeant Mason Reed. Rescue is here. For one long second, there was only rain. Then a woman's voice answered from the front seat. Mason. The sound of his name carried years of distance between them. Yes. Stay still. We are securing the vehicle. He moved his light toward the rear compartment. Eli was suspended safely by his seat belt, wrapped in a gray winter jacket. His face looked pale in the cold light, and each breath came too quickly. He saw Atlas and reached one hand toward the window. He came back, Eli whispered. Atlas pressed close to the opening, his ears lowered with concern. The boy's breathing eased for a moment when their eyes met. Mason crouched beside the window. Eli, I have your inhaler. Atlas brought it to me. The boy nodded, but his fingers trembled too much to reach. Mason looked over the vehicle. The rear window offered the safest access, but no one could enter until the sport utility vehicle was anchored. Above them, Captain Delgado's voice came through the radio. Mason, we are sending down 2 lines and a stabilization strut. Do not open any doors. Understood. 2 patients conscious. Eli is having trouble breathing. Vehicle is about 10 feet from moving water and resting on unstable ground. Sarah spoke from the front. Is he all right? He is awake, and he is looking at Atlas. Keep talking to him. Mason reached through the window and placed the inhaler where Eli could see it. Listen to my voice. We are going to do this slowly. Atlas laid down beside the opening, ignoring the cold mud beneath him. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the child. Mason counted each breath with Eli, making his own voice calm and even. Above, ropes slid through the rain. One volunteer lowered the winch line while another guided the stabilization strut toward the rear frame. Mason clipped the first line to a solid recovery point beneath the vehicle. Captain Delgado tightened it from the road until the cable hummed with tension. The sport utility vehicle shifted less than an inch, but the movement silenced everyone. Mud slipped from beneath the rear tire and rolled toward the creek. Atlas gave one sharp bark. Mason placed a hand against the window frame and looked at Eli. Stay with me. You are not alone. The second line arrived. Mason secured it, then passed the inhaler carefully through the opening. Eli tried to take it, but his hand missed. Mason reached farther, guiding it gently into his grasp. That is it. One step at a time. Sarah began counting with them from the front seat. Atlas remained still between their voices, a living bridge from the trapped vehicle to the people above. When Eli finally drew a slower breath, Mason heard Captain Delgado over the radio. Primary anchor is holding. We are ready to begin the extraction. Then the ground beneath the rear of the vehicle settled again. The vehicle settled less than an inch, but the sound of shifting earth moved through the darkness like a warning. Mason kept one hand against the rear frame and looked toward the slope above. The winch cable remained tight. The stabilization strut held. Still, Mill Creek continued to rise beyond the trees, carrying branches through the black water. Captain Delgado's voice came over the radio. We extract Sarah first. Then Eli. Keep everyone still until the secondary line is locked. Mason answered, Understood. He leaned toward the broken rear window. Sarah, we are bringing you out through the driver's side opening. Do not release your seat belt until I tell you. Her breathing was controlled, but fear lived beneath every word. Take Eli first. The safest order is you, then him. Atlas is staying with Eli. The German shepherd remained beside the rear opening, his body pressed close enough for the boy to see him. Mud covered the protective wraps around his paws, but he did not move away. Eli held the inhaler with both hands now. His breaths were slower, though still shallow. Mason met his eyes. You are doing well. Keep watching, Atlas. Eli nodded. He always comes back. Above them, a locking hook clicked into place. Captain Delgado confirmed the second anchor. Mason moved carefully toward the front of the sport utility vehicle and attached a rescue harness around Sarah through the upper door opening. He explained each step before touching a buckle or moving a strap. Nothing happened quickly. Nothing happened without warning. When the system was ready, the volunteers pulled from above while Mason guided Sarah through the opening and onto the slope. She reached solid ground, then turned immediately toward the vehicle. Eli, I am going back for him. Mason descended again before she could say more. The rain had softened, but the creek sounded louder. Atlas lifted his head when Mason returned. Eli's face brightened for a moment. Mason secured a child rescue sling through the rear window and guided it around the boy's shoulders. I need you to keep your head back and your hands near your chest. Can Atlas come with me? He will be right beside you. Mason released the seat belt slowly. The vehicle shifted again, and a clump of mud slid toward the water. Atlas barked once, then stood close to the window. Mason placed one arm beneath Eli while the rope team took the boy's weight. On my count. 1, 2, 3. Eli moved through the opening into Mason's arms. He was cold, frightened, and lighter than Mason expected. Mason held him close while the rescue line tightened. Atlas climbed beside them, matching every step as they moved upward. Halfway to the road, the vehicle slipped another few inches, stopped by the cables and the 2 trees. No one looked back. At the top, Sarah dropped to her knees and wrapped Eli in a thermal blanket. The boy reached immediately for Atlas. The German shepherd pressed his head beneath Eli's chin and finally allowed his tired body to rest. Captain Delgado placed an oxygen mask near the child's face while checking his breathing. "He is stable," she said. Only then did Mason kneel beside Atlas and examine the soaked bandages around his paws. Sarah watched him with tears in her eyes. "He ran all the way to you." Mason looked toward the dark road, then at the boy holding the dog's faded red collar. For 4 years, Mason had believed distance was the only thing he could offer this family. Atlas had crossed 3 miles of freezing rain to prove him wrong. The emergency lights washed the roadside in quiet red as Sarah and Eli were moved into the heated rescue truck. Atlas lay on a folded blanket between them, his head resting across the boy's boots. A volunteer cleaned the mud from his paws and replaced the wet bandages with dry protective wraps. The German shepherd watched every movement but offered no resistance now. His work was finished. Mason stood near the open truck door, rain sliding from the shoulders of his yellow jacket. He could hear Captain Delgado speaking with County Dispatch and the steady pull of the winch holding the empty vehicle below. Everything around him had returned to procedure. Medical checks, equipment counts, road closures. Yet nothing inside him felt orderly. Sarah looked up from the bench seat. Her face was pale from the cold, but her voice remained gentle. "You still turn away when you are afraid someone might thank you." Mason lowered his eyes. Tonight was Atlas. I only followed him. He chose where to go. She reached down and touched the faded red collar. He passed 2 houses with lights on. He passed the ranger station. He kept going to Station 7. Eli pulled the thermal blanket closer around his shoulders. "Dad taught him," the boy said. Mason looked at him. Eli's breathing had settled into a calm rhythm, and the blue inhaler rested safely in his hand. "Taught him what?" "Find help." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering. Caleb used that command during community demonstrations. He would hide behind the apparatus bay, tell Atlas to find help, and the dog would run to the bell rope. A small smile appeared through her exhaustion. The children thought it was the greatest trick in the world. Mason remembered the summer afternoon clearly. Caleb laughing beneath the bronze bell. Atlas pulling the rope while Eli clapped from his father's shoulders. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a game. Tonight, the same lesson had carried a child through 3 miles of darkness. When the vehicle stopped, Eli continued. "Mom could not reach her phone. I could not breathe right. Atlas was scared, but he stayed with me. I gave him the inhaler and said what Dad used to say." His fingers tightened around the blanket. "I told him to find help." Mason looked toward the forest where the road disappeared beneath wet branches. Atlas had climbed through the broken rear window, crossed the ravine, followed the old service lane, and reached a station he had not visited in years. He had remembered the bell. He had remembered the command. Perhaps he had remembered Mason. Sarah studied the Marine's face. "Caleb always believed Atlas would find you if we ever needed someone." The words landed softly, but Mason felt their full weight. "I should have come sooner," he said. "After the funeral. After any of it." Sarah did not excuse him. She did not accuse him either. She simply moved aside on the bench, leaving an open place beside Eli and Atlas. "You came tonight." Mason hesitated before stepping into the rescue truck. Atlas lifted his head and rested one wrapped paw against Mason's boot. Eli leaned closer to the dog. Sarah looked out through the rain-streaked window and whispered, "He found the right house." For the first time in 4 years, Mason did not search for a reason to leave. By the time the rescue truck reached Pine Hollow Medical Center, the freezing rain had weakened to a silver mist. Nurses met Sarah and Eli beneath the covered entrance, wrapping them in warm blankets before guiding them through the sliding doors. Mason walked beside the stretcher, carrying the blue inhaler in one hand, while Atlas followed slowly on freshly wrapped paws. The German shepherd's head remained level, but exhaustion had softened every step. A veterinarian from the county emergency clinic was already waiting in the lobby. She knelt beside Atlas, checked his breathing, and examined the shallow scrapes caused by gravel, brush, and broken safety glass. "He needs rest, warmth, and clean bandages," she said. "Nothing more serious than that." Mason released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Atlas looked past the veterinarian toward Eli until the boy raised one hand from the examination bed. Only then did the dog lower himself onto the blanket. Sarah sat nearby while a nurse checked her temperature and blood pressure. In the quiet light of the treatment room, the distance of 4 years felt more visible than it had in the storm. Mason stood near the doorway, unsure whether he belonged inside. Sarah noticed. "You can sit down," she said. Mason took the chair across from her. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The room held the soft sounds of medical equipment, rain against glass, and Atlas breathing beside Eli's bed. At last, Sarah reached into the pocket of her damp coat and removed a small brass tag. Its surface was worn smooth around the edges. One side carried Caleb's name. The other carried the number for Station 7. "He kept this on Atlas during every community demonstration," she said. Mason turned it over in his palm. "Caleb said a rescue dog should always know 2 things: who needs help and where help lives." Mason looked toward Atlas. The dog had crossed miles of forest and darkness, ignored his own discomfort, and chosen the one place connected to both Caleb and Mason. "He could have stopped at another house," Mason said. "He did not." Sarah's voice remained calm. "Atlas knew the station, but I think he also knew you." Mason wanted to argue that dogs followed scent, training, and habit. All of that was true, yet Atlas had stood beneath the bell until Mason opened the door. He had carried Eli's inhaler directly to him. He had refused treatment until the rescue truck faced the correct road. Some forms of faith did not need to be explained in order to be real. Eli opened his eyes. "Dad said you never left anyone behind." Mason lowered his gaze to the brass tag. "Your father believed better things about me than I did." Maybe Atlas believed him. The words came without blame. That made them harder to resist. Atlas lifted his head and placed his chin on the edge of Eli's blanket. The boy smiled and rested his fingers between the dog's ears. Mason watched them together and understood that Caleb's final lesson had never been about teaching a dog to pull a rope. It had been about giving loyalty somewhere to go when every other path was dark. Mason returned the tag to Sarah, but she closed his fingers around it. "Keep it until you are ready to come by the house." This time, Mason did not offer a promise for another day. "I will come tomorrow." Atlas's tail moved once against the floor, quiet as a second chance. The next afternoon, Mason stood outside the Whitmore home with Caleb's brass tag resting in his coat pocket. The storm had passed, leaving Pine Hollow beneath a pale winter sky. Water dripped from the porch roof, and broken branches lay in neat piles along the street. Mason had faced dangerous roads, unstable vehicles, and nights when every decision carried weight. None of them had made his hand hesitate over a doorbell the way this one did. Before he could press it, the door opened. Atlas stood on the other side with clean white wraps around all 4 paws. His faded red collar had been washed, and his amber eyes were bright again. The German shepherd stepped forward, touched his nose to Mason's hand, then turned toward the living room as though the visit had already been expected. Sarah sat near the fireplace with one ankle supported on a cushion. Eli rested beneath a quilt on the couch, watching an old rescue documentary with the sound turned low. A small oxygen monitor rested on the table beside his inhaler, but color had returned to his face. "You came?" Eli said. Mason removed his coat. "I said I would." The words were simple, but Sarah heard what they cost him. She pointed toward the chair beside the fireplace. On the wall above it hung photographs Mason had never allowed himself to see. Caleb holding Eli as a newborn. Caleb and Sarah standing beneath the old station bell. Atlas wearing his first rescue vest. One photograph showed Mason beside Caleb during a training exercise, both men covered in rain and laughing at something outside the frame. Mason looked away, but not before the memory reached him. Caleb had never been serious for long. Even on difficult days, he found a reason to make everyone breathe easier. Atlas settled at Mason's boots. Eli lowered the volume on the television. Mom said Dad left something for you. Sarah reached into a wooden box on the mantel and removed a sealed envelope. Mason's name was written across the front in Caleb's uneven handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly along the edges. He wrote it before his last deployment, Sarah said. He asked me to give it to you if he did not come home. I tried after the service, but you were already gone. Mason accepted the envelope carefully. I was not ready. I know. She did not say it to absolve him. She said it because truth no longer needed punishment. Mason turned the envelope over but did not open it. Not yet. Eli watched him for a moment, then reached down and scratched behind Atlas's ears. Do you think he knew where he was going that night? Atlas? Mason asked. The boy nodded. Mason looked at the German shepherd. He knew the command. He remembered the station. He knew the bell meant someone would come. But did he know you would be there? Mason felt the brass tag in his pocket. He could have answered with training, scent, or chance. Instead, he said, I think he trusted that someone would be. Sarah looked toward Caleb's photograph. Your father taught him where help lived? Mason told Eli. You reminded him how to find it. Atlas lifted his head at the sound of Caleb's name, then placed one wrapped paw on Mason's boot. Mason opened the envelope. The first line was short. If you are reading this, stop blaming yourself. Mason closed his eyes. The room remained quiet around him. No sirens. No rain. Only the soft fire, a child breathing steadily, and a loyal dog waiting beside the man he had finally led home.